Palermo, dawn. A black Mercedes idles outside a bar that hasn't officially opened in years. Inside, the espresso machine is warm. The lights are on. No receipts are printed. This isn't corruption. It's governance. For over 150 years, Italy has lived with two systems of power operating side by side. One wears suits, holds elections, and passes laws. The other settles disputes, controls markets, and decides who gets paid. The mafia didn't survive because the Italian state failed to fight it. It survived because it learned how to coexist with the state and outperform it. This is the story of why the mafia never disappeared and how Italy became home to one of the most sophisticated systems of parallel power ever built. The mafia did not begin as a criminal organization. That label came later, after the state arrived and declared a monopoly on authority. At the start, the mafia functioned as something else entirely, a service provider. In 19th century southern Italy, the newly unified Italian state existed more on paper than in practice. Government authority was distant, slow, and deeply distrusted. Courts were corrupt or inaccessible. Police presence was minimal. Property rights, especially in rural areas, were uncertain and easily violated. For ordinary people, appealing to the state often meant delays, bribes, or no resolution at all. Into that vacuum stepped the mafia. They enforced contracts when courts could not. They protected landowners when police were absent. They recovered stolen goods when reporting theft was pointless. And they settled disputes, quickly, decisively, and often violently. The methods were brutal, but the outcomes were reliable. In an environment where predictability mattered more than legality, that reliability had value. Before it was illegal, the mafia was useful. This usefulness is what allowed it to embed itself so deeply. The mafia didn't overthrow the state. It operated where the state failed. It offered order in places defined by uncertainty. Violence wasn't random, it was instrumental, a tool to make agreements stick and boundaries clear. For communities accustomed to neglect, the mafia didn't look like an enemy. It looked like infrastructure, a parallel system of enforcement that worked when the official one didn't. Trust didn't come from legitimacy or law. It came from effectiveness. Understanding this matters because it explains why the mafia proved so resilient. It wasn't born as rebellion against the state, it was born as a substitute for it. And once people reorganize their lives around a substitute, removing it becomes far harder than outlawing it. The mafia wasn't powerful because it was criminal. It became criminal because the state finally arrived and tried to replace it. The Italian state rules through law. The mafia rules through certainty. That distinction explains almost everything. Laws require enforcement, time, and trust. In much of southern Italy, those elements were historically fragile or absent. Court rulings could take years. Police could be bribed, intimidated, or simply never arrive. Legal outcomes were unpredictable, and unpredictability is poison in daily life. The mafia offered something different. If it promised protection, it delivered. If it threatened punishment, it followed through. There was no appeals process, no backlog, no ambiguity. The outcome was clear, and it happened quickly. That reliability made the mafia competitive with the state, not morally, but functionally. For landowners, merchants, and families, this wasn't an abstract choice about legality. It was practical. Who could actually guarantee safety? Who could enforce agreements? Who could respond today, not in 5 years? In many cases, the answer wasn't the state. That's why the real choice wasn't between legality and crime. It was between ineffective authority and functional violence. The mafia's power didn't come from ideology or popular support. It came from performance. Violence was not chaotic, it was calibrated. It existed to make promises credible and threats believable. Once that credibility was established, the mafia didn't need constant force. Reputation did the work. This created a parallel system of power. The state claimed legitimacy on paper. The mafia exercised authority in practice. People might resent it, fear it, or despise it, but they also relied on it. And reliance is stronger than belief. Crucially, this trade-off never disappeared. Even as the Italian state expanded, modernized, and asserted itself, the memory of certainty remained. In moments of crisis, delay, or distrust, the mafia's model still appealed, not because it was just, but because it worked. Authority doesn't need legitimacy to function. It needs predictability. In Sicily, Cosa Nostra created what became the foundational model for modern organized crime. Not a gang, not a single syndicate, but a system. That system was built around families, known as kosh. Each family controlled a defined territory, managing protection, enforcement, and local relationships within its borders. Territory mattered, but conquest was limited. Expansion without consent invited instability, not dominance. Boundaries were meant to be respected. To manage inevitable conflict, Cosa Nostra developed something more sophisticated: a commission. This body existed to arbitrate disputes between families, regulate violence, and prevent internal wars that could attract unwanted attention. It wasn't a government, but it functioned like one, setting rules, mediating conflicts, and maintaining equilibrium. Crucially, even at its peak, Cosa Nostra was never truly centralized. There was no permanent supreme leader ruling Sicily indefinitely. Power rotated. It fractured. It rebalanced. Strong bosses emerged, but none could monopolize authority forever. Ambition was checked by structure, and dominance was always temporary. That design choice mattered. When leaders were arrested or killed, the system didn't collapse. It absorbed the loss. Other figures stepped in. Alliances shifted. Violence spiked briefly, then settled. The organization treated leadership removal as disruption, not annihilation. This is why comparisons to corporations or armies miss the point. Cosa Nostra didn't rely on charismatic leadership or rigid chains of command. It relied on continuity. Roles mattered more than personalities. Procedures mattered more than loyalty to a single man. In that sense, it behaved less like a criminal gang and more like a state. States survive elections, coups, and assassinations because institutions outlast individuals. Cosa Nostra was built on the same principle. The blueprint wasn't about ruling forever. It was about surviving indefinitely. After World War II, Italy rebuilt rapidly through massive public works. Huge sums of state money flowed south, and the mafia followed. Instead of stealing cash, the mafia redirected it. Construction contracts, waste management, transport, and public works were quietly captured. Everything looked legal on paper. Violence faded into the background. Access became the weapon. Permits, tenders, invoices, and subcontractors replaced guns and extortion notes. By embedding itself in the legal economy, the mafia became invisible. A construction site was just a construction site. The difference was who controlled it and how conflicts were settled off the books. This changed everything. Fighting the mafia now meant dismantling industries, shutting down companies, canceling essential contracts, and disrupting daily life. Prosecutors weren't just targeting criminals, but entire economic systems. The post-war boom didn't weaken the mafia, it professionalized it. In Naples, the mafia took a different path. The Camorra didn't inherit the rigid traditions of Sicily. It didn't rely on ancient rituals, strict initiation rites, or carefully balanced hierarchies. What it lacked in order, it made up for in speed. Less ritual, less hierarchy, more chaos, but also more adaptability. The Camorra evolved as a loose ecosystem of clans rather than a single system. Groups formed, split, collapsed, and reformed constantly. Leadership was unstable. Alliances shifted quickly. Violence was frequent, but fragmentation made the organization harder to eliminate. There was no ceremonial structure to dismantle and no commission to arbitrate disputes. Disorder was not a flaw, it was a feature. This flexibility allowed the Camorra to move aggressively into emerging markets. Counterfeit goods, drug trafficking, waste disposal, fashion and logistics. Wherever profit appeared, especially in fast-moving, poorly regulated sectors, the Camorra followed. Unlike older mafia structures that focused on controlling territory and protecting existing power arrangements, the Camorra chased opportunity. It didn't defend landowners or maintain social order. It exploited supply chains, ports, factories, and consumer demand. Its strength wasn't authority, it was responsiveness. That made it perfectly suited to modern capitalism. As production globalized and logistics accelerated, the Camorra embedded itself into the flow of goods. Fake luxury items moved alongside real ones. Illegal waste disappeared through legitimate contracts. Drugs traveled the same routes as fashion and food. The lines between legal and illegal blurred, not through secrecy, but through volume and speed. The Camorra didn't protect the old order. It exploited the new one. This made it both more volatile and more resilient. Arrests didn't destabilize the whole system. They reshuffled it. Violence didn't signal collapse. It signaled competition. Where tradition constrained other mafia groups, the Camorra treated instability as a resource. In Naples, crime didn't fossilize into ritual. It evolved into a market strategy. While Sicily fought internal wars and Naples burned with visible chaos, Calabria stayed quiet. That silence wasn't a weakness. It was a strategy. The 'Ndrangheta didn't seek attention, headlines, or public dominance. It built inward. Its foundation was blood-based membership, familial ties that made infiltration extraordinarily difficult. Betrayal wasn't just disloyalty. It meant turning on your own relatives. That structure created absolute internal loyalty, enforced not by spectacle, but by permanence. While other groups focused on territory and reputation, the 'Ndrangheta focused on logistics. It invested patiently in global cocaine supply chains, embedding itself at every stage, from production zones to ports, distributors, and financial channels. Violence was minimized not out of restraint, but because it was inefficient. Attention disrupted routes. Silence protected them. Over time, that approach paid off. Today, the 'Ndrangheta is widely considered the most powerful mafia group in Europe, possibly the world. Not because it kills more, not because it controls the loudest streets, but because it moves money better than anyone else. Its operations blend seamlessly into legitimate economies. Profits are laundered through construction, logistics, finance, and international trade. Decisions are slow, deliberate, and insulated from emotion. There are no public bosses to hunt, and no dramatic wars to exploit. Leadership is collective, familial, and resilient. This is what power looks like when survival matters more than dominance. The 'Ndrangheta didn't win by outgunning rivals. It won by outlasting them. While others burned capital, human and financial, Calabria compounded it quietly. The result is an organization that rarely makes headlines, rarely fractures, and rarely fails. Law enforcement can disrupt cells, seize assets, and arrest individuals, but the core remains intact, bound by blood and patience. The 'Ndrangheta doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The Italian state arrested bosses, passed harsh laws, and staged public trials. It looked like progress, yet the mafia survived. The flaw was the assumption that leadership was the core asset. It wasn't. Arresting bosses disrupted operations, but didn't dismantle power. Power lived in social networks, economic control, and cultural silence. When a boss fell, relationships and businesses remained, and someone else quietly coordinated. Decapitation treated the mafia like a pyramid. It was an ecosystem. Cut one branch, and power rerouted. You can imprison a man. You can't imprison a relationship. In the 1980s, Italian law enforcement intensified its campaign against organized crime more than any other country. Maxi trials, special prosecutors, asset seizures, witness protection. These measures weakened the mafia, but didn't erase it. Why? Because the mafia doesn't need to defeat the state. It just needs to outlast political attention. Modern Italian mafias no longer rely on public terror. Bombs and massacres drew attention, and attention brought pressure, so they adapted. Today, power is quieter. Corporate fronts, political lobbying, financial engineering, and cross-border investments that hide criminal capital inside legal markets. This isn't restraint, it's optimization. Violence still exists, but it's rare and controlled, used internally or as a last resort. Public bloodshed is avoided because it's inefficient. A killing attracts journalists. A lawsuit attracts almost no one. Influence now flows through contracts, partnerships, and capital, not threats. Investigators don't find extortion notes, they find balance sheets. Crime dissolves into normality. A visible mafia can be attacked. An invisible one forces the state to confront its own systems. This is organized crime under pressure, not domination, but integration. Not ruling streets, owning flows. Today, the mafia still exists because it offers what many systems still fail to provide: speed, certainty, access, enforcement, As long as markets are regulated unevenly, bureaucracy is slow, and trust in institutions is fragile, the mafia remains competitive, not as rebellion, but as infrastructure. The mafia never disappeared because it was never an outsider. It grew alongside the Italian state, fed on its gaps, adapted to its reforms. Every time Italy modernized, the mafia modernized with it. Not louder, not bloodier, just smarter. And that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. The mafia isn't a shadow cast by a weak state. It's a parallel power, built to survive any one government, any one law, any one generation. Because systems don't die when you arrest their leaders. They die when they stop being useful. And in Italy, the mafia never stopped being useful.